We're going to go back in time and we're going to take a look at how my feminized brain and my feminized body affected me. So firstly, we're going to go to when I was 13 years old. I was playing with toys, I was playing with figures. That's all I was doing. That's all I was focused on, toys and figures. Whilst other boys that were my age, they were going out with their mates. They were, talking to girls. They were doing all of this stuff which you could consider far more mature. Then we moved to college. In college, I was a yes man. I was a people pleaser. I was a follower, a sheep. I couldn't lead myself through any situation. I was the nice guy, not because being nice to everyone was my decision, not because my intent was to be nice, but because I was so fearful, so anxious, so incapable that I just shut down in every situation, and I had to be nice, regardless of what you said, regardless of who you were. So my focus in life was to make myself safe and comfortable. At around 19, I was terrified of conflict and confrontation. Every time I held eye contact with strangers, my anxiousness would go through the fucking roof. Every conversation I had, I would submit. I would smile out of panic, regardless of what was being said and regardless of who was saying it. And every time I spoke, it was to agree and validate other people. So who I was completely determined by who I was around. If you didn't like X, I didn't like X. If I loved you, I couldn't tell you. If I hated you, I couldn't tell you. Because I was petrified of showing anyone the real me. I was ugly. I was a coward socially, as I allowed any anxiety and fear to stop me. I was submissive. I couldn't lead. I was a follower, not a leader. I was scared into quietness rather than assertiveness. And my only ambition was Grand Champion on Rocket League. And some arena on Fortnite intertwined with that. Now, the worst part about all of this is I was content with this. I was content with the force or the fear that forced me to submit, be quiet, and turn into a coward. But it was, and I was content because I would come home, I would play video games, I would play with toys, and I would just fill my life at home with as much instant gratification, as much instant pleasure as I could. And so because I got that, it was okay to suffer and be a coward. Now, just to add some scientific evidence to the fact that my brain was feminized, truly feminized, is there was a study recently done where they measured what women and men did after they had been in a social situation, after they had had some kind of conversation. And what they found is that nearly every single woman would rethink the conversation that she had just had. And the men were the complete opposite. Now me, a few years ago, when I was 19, every single conversation I had, I would think so deeply about it the second it ended. The second I got away from that scenario. I would be thinking about how my perception or how I was perceived based on what I said. And then I would also think about exactly what I could have said that would have been way better. So the question is, how did I fix this? Firstly, I came across some male influencers on YouTube. David Goggins, Andrew Tate, and Jordan Peterson. Each of these influencers offered me a solution to my problem, to my weakness. The first one was David Goggins. His solution was mental toughness. I watched his podcasts and I read his books and I started to believe that pain was nothing. This made me train to levels of failure in the gym that no one else does. I'm talking every single exercise I did was a drop set. So let's say we're doing dips. I'm going to do a drop set. And every single set in that drop set is going to be till failure. And that as a whole is going to be repeated times 3. So imagine you've got 50 kg strapped around you for dips. You do 10 reps and you fail at the 10th rep. Then you drop it down to 20 kg. You do 20 reps, fail at 20 reps with no rest in between. Drop the 20 kg. Then you do body weight. And you do body weight till failure. And then you rest and you do that 3 times. That's what I did for every single exercise that I did. And it made me more resistant to physical pain, but it did nothing else. You know, I watched his podcasts and I felt tough in my room, but my fear still made me cowardly. I was still submissive. I still wasn't dominant. I still didn't have the desire to lead and protect. I still had no masculine traits or characteristics. That was what I truly wanted. So the second male influencer I came across was Andrew Tate. His whole thing was get rich, right? So I joined the real world. I started studying loads and I started trying to get rich. And the way I did this was I started a course called Growth Academy. Long story short, it got to around $1,500 a month, considering I went from nothing, by the way. So nothing to $1,500 a month in the space of maybe 6 months. Now, Growth Academy, the students' results were phenomenal. Every single person that joined Growth Academy was gaining millions and millions of views within like their first month. So why did I stop? Because when I went from nothing to making 1.5k a month, I realized that from the stage of making nothing to the stage of making 500 a month to the stage of making 1,500 a month, over that entire period, nothing about me changed. I was still a coward. I still didn't have any motivation or ambition to protect and, you know, lead and dominate. I still wasn't courageous. I still wasn't a leader, as I've just repeated. I still wasn't assertive. I was still afraid of confrontation. I was still afraid to show my aggression. I hadn't developed any masculine traits or characteristics during that time. So that was a failure. The third male influencer was Jordan Peterson. Now, he was saying become intelligent and articulate. So this made me think that knowledge was the solution. So I bought all the books he recommended, read through them as quickly as possible, watched all his podcasts, and I learned quite a lot about psychology, biology, and other alike topics. But after doing that, I had knowledge, but I was still weak. I was still cowardly. I still couldn't lead. Still not bold or assertive. Still submissive, etc. The funny thing about that was I did gain a lot of knowledge from that, but I could not fucking articulate a single word because of the negative emotion I was still full of, the cowardness I still embodied. So after this failed, I moved off from the male influencers and I started going towards self-improvement books. My bookshelf is fucking full of self-improvement books. So yeah, I bought every single book I could find on self-improvement, discipline, social skills, leadership. And I spent months reading non-stop, hoping that reading this book on social cues by Vanessa Van Edwards would instantly give me the ability to read social cues. Now, obviously, that just does not work. And then also reading another book on how to make friends and influence people by Dale would also instantly give me those skills. And reading a book on leadership by Jocko Willink. Reading a book on, what else have we got? Stoicism would instantly turn me into a stoic. And obviously, this is all false. You can't just read a book with no practical aspect and expect it to embody you, right? So soon I found out they did absolutely nothing. And it was primarily because all I did was read when I should have, as I just said, acted on the information I was receiving. So after all of these failures, I finally identified my problem after coming across a hormone called testosterone. Scrolling on social media, certain videos started to show me the effects of testosterone, such as strength, confidence, aggression, assertiveness, etc. All the things of which I desired. And at this point, I became obsessed with testosterone and male hormones. So much that I ended up studying it like crazy. I studied multiple ebooks on testosterone. I also bought around 5 physical books, of which I read and studied as well. Some on DHT, some on testosterone. And to accompany that, I also bought a lot of books on science, biology, which I also studied and read. So this is when I identified my problem. I realized all my actions, beliefs, and behaviors aligned with a poor male hormonal profile, aka what a lot of people will commonly refer to as low testosterone today. So for example, I realized that my lack of desire to lead and dominate social conversations and situations was actually a consequence of my poor male hormonal profile. That's just one of many examples. And so when I realized this, I started to implement the methods that I had learned that were said to maximize male hormones, such as testosterone and DHT. So over time, I noticed my physical looks changed a little bit, my strength increased slightly, and a very few mental changes were starting to take place. Only very few though, nothing significant, nothing crazy, such as my desire to be more dominant. However, there were still many things that hadn't changed, like I was still afraid of confrontation. I was still submissive, I still didn't have that desire to lead a conversation. That desire to protect. I was just still incapable in so many ways. Incapable of leading, incapable of providing, protecting, and dominating, and all of these things, right? Even though I was doing all of these researched methods in order to increase my testosterone, DHT, and male hormones. So at this point, I knew the problem, but the solution didn't entirely work. The current solution that I had. Now, during this time, I was still watching Jordan Peterson. And at this time, Jordan Peterson had started to pick up quite heavily on content relating to the Bible, which also made me interested in it as well. So I started watching all of Jordan Peterson's podcasts on the Bible. And I also paid for a subscription on a website where he posted regularly a biblical series where him and 12 other very credible people would sit at a table and they would go through the Bible and interpret it. Then I found the debate scene, which I got heavily interested in. So at this point, I decided to start studying the Bible myself. And this is when I started to notice very clear correlations between biblical teaching, biblical commandments. And this is when I started to notice very clear correlations between the biblical commands for men and high testosterone and high DHT effects, which I had studied previously. So I noticed the traits and characteristics that God was commanding men to have were literally the traits and characteristics that were produced by the optimization of male hormones. And then I also noticed the environment that the Bible commands men to create for themselves contained all of the things of which science demonstrates significantly increased testosterone, DHT, and male hormones. And this is when I realized that the reason I was failing to develop these masculine traits, dominance, assertiveness, leadership, courage, fearlessness, stoicism, self-control, strength, all of these things, the reason I was failing to develop these traits was because I was missing the most important factor for male hormone optimization. And it was the one that the Bible was making extremely clear: your environment. And specifically the exact environment to every micro detail that the Bible demands men to create for themselves. And so then you can imagine the path I went down. I started to study the exact environment that the Bible tells us to create. And I started to study the exact micro details of that environment. And simultaneously, I was finding that every single thing that the Bible was telling you to create within your environment, to design within your environment, was optimal for male hormones. So as I studied the Bible, as I come across actions, beliefs, and behaviors that the Bible told us either to do or not to do, I would implement them into my life. For example, always speaking the truth, because lying is avoidance of confrontation and conflict. Now, what was the most common trait I noticed in myself when I was weak and feminized? The avoidance of confrontation and conflict. So what happens when you start telling the truth consistently is your environment changes. You face conflict and confrontation, and you do not run from it. Therefore, you need the traits and characteristics that enable you to deal with that conflict and confrontation. So how does just to firstly clarify, the traits and characteristics that enable you to deal with conflict and confrontation is going to be masculine traits, such as aggressiveness, willing to be aggressive, assertiveness, dominance, etc. Courage. They are all essential to face conflict and confrontation. So how does your body equip you with them now that you have to face them? It increases your male hormones, because male hormones affect your aggression. It has a direct effect on your willingness to use your aggression. It affects your dominance. It affects your courage. So your body will adapt to whatever your environment requires, to whatever your environment demands, and the Bible evidently knows this. So after I started implementing these, what actually happened? So my looks transformed significantly, my bone structure developed, my fat distribution started to change. There's feminine fat distribution and there's masculine fat distribution. So then next, my aggression in training became extremely prominent. Not just in the gym when lifting weights, but when training things like judo, jiu-jitsu, I really felt that aggression. Then you had my willingness to face confrontation and conflict skyrocketed, and this is commonly interpreted as a willingness to take a risk. You're much less deterred by fear. And not only that, but you feel anxiety, you feel fear, and you're just willing to walk straight fucking at it. You could be full of anxiety, but it's like, it's not that significant of a problem for you anymore. It's like you feel it, but you just act anyway. Then my dopamine system completely changed. It got completely rewired. My desire to lead, to dominate, to protect has become very prevalent, even in just a conversation. Your desire to lead the conversation, to dominate the conversation, to protect whoever is weaker than you, all of those desires significantly increase because your dopamine system gets rewired to reward you for actions that are masculine and on a biological level beneficial to your reproduction and reproductive ability. So leading, being bold, risk-taking is no longer scary, it's actually satisfying. Then of course my physique, my body is masculinized, lean, no fat, pure muscle. And then also, due to my implementation of biblical teaching, my relationship with God 10x'd. I mean, you got to think, if I'm following the Bible in the way that I said, I'm significantly reducing my sin, and I'm significantly increasing the teachings of God. So my relationship with him extremely strengthened, and now I am able to use this masculine power that I've developed, and I'm developing, because there's no limit to this. There's no limit to how good of a leader you can become. There's no limit to how dominant you can become, how strong you can become, how good you can become at protecting, providing, serving, etc. There's no limit to it. So it's an infinite purpose, firstly. And secondly, because my relationship with God is now so much stronger, I know exactly what I'm going to use this masculine power for. And it is for God, for what God tells me to use it for. to obey God with this masculine power that I have created, to protect, to serve, to lead, to provide, and of course to love. Now, if you're in a similar situation to what I was, and you would like to work with me one-to-one, then you can book a free call in my bio and we can have a conversation to see if you really want to change.